The former national president of the Mongols Motorcycle Gang has pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy. These charges involve homicides, narcotics trafficking, and acts of extreme violence. The case against Reuben Cavazos stems from a broader investigation accusing other Mongols members of murder, drug distribution, and violent assaults. In the hidden hierarchy of the American underworld, Cavazos proclaimed himself an emperor. As the self-declared president for life of the Mongols Motorcycle Club, he oversaw far more than a biker club. It became a powerful organization bound by loyalty, fear, and criminal activity. Investigators later alleged that Cavazos even placed undercover ATF informants in decision-making roles within the club. How did a man who once held enormous influence in the biker subculture lose control of his own empire? Was he a master manipulator or a man consumed by the very power he craved? From his seemingly unshakable position at the top, Cavazos believed his legacy was permanent, built on the scars of his rivals and the patches worn by his followers. But empires rarely fall only to outside enemies. Sometimes they collapse from within. The loyalty he demanded became the weapon that would ultimately destroy him. This is not simply a story about arrests or criminal trials. It is a tale of betrayal, ambition, and a violent internal struggle, a downfall that played out in clubhouses and courtrooms, a federal case that shattered the myth surrounding a man who many believed was untouchable. Former associates described Cavazos as someone who barely rode a motorcycle and may have feared them, contradicting the image he projected to the world. Others suggest he may have been overwhelmed by a criminal world he could no longer control. The events that followed culminated on October 21, 2008, the day the Mongols Empire was struck at its core. To understand the magnitude of Cavazos's fall, one must understand the empire he helped build. The Mongols Motorcycle Club emerged in the 1970s in East Los Angeles. After the death of his mother, Cavazos's father moved the family into the violence-ridden neighborhoods of Northeast Los Angeles. Cavazos became involved in the Avenues gang, believing that lifestyle defined him. The Mongols were founded by Latino bikers who felt excluded by predominantly white clubs. They began as underdogs, determined, aggressive, and fiercely loyal. Over the decades, they expanded, fought with rivals, and grew into one of the most feared motorcycle clubs on the West Coast. By the early 2000s, they were no longer overshadowed by larger groups. They were a dominant force, and Cavazos was their leader. Cavazos was a different kind of outlaw, not just a fighter, but a strategist. He approached the Mongols like a corporation. The club evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise involving large-scale narcotics trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and weapons distribution. Cavazos centralized power like a CEO, consolidating control. He handed out the coveted center patch, the Mongols' sacred symbol, while demanding absolute loyalty. His title, President for Life, became part of the organization's identity, but it also planted the seeds of conflict. Under his rule, the club grew rapidly, recruiting hundreds of new members to strengthen his power. With numbers on his side, he overshadowed existing leadership and cemented his authority. The Mongols were involved in violent confrontations, including the infamous Laughlin, Nevada casino brawl, in which one Mongol and two Hell's Angels were killed. But the same expansion that made the Mongols powerful also drew intense federal scrutiny. The U.S. government was quietly building a case through surveillance and wiretaps. Their target was not just individual members, it was the organization itself. Agents realized that the patch worn by Mongols members was more than a logo. It was their identity, their flag, and their source of pride. If law enforcement could attack that symbol, they could inflict a psychological blow that would shake the club at its foundation. Their strategy became clear: use the RICO Act not only to prosecute individuals, but to dismantle the structure of the organization. Part of that structure included the Mongols' most sacred asset, their intellectual property. On October 21, 2008, federal agents launched Operation Black Rain, a coordinated raid across multiple states. Dozens of Mongols members were arrested, including high-ranking officers. Charges included racketeering conspiracy, drug trafficking, murder, and robbery. Hidden within the 177-page indictment was a groundbreaking demand. The government sought the criminal forfeiture of the Mongols' trademarked patch. The goal was not just prison sentences, it was the destruction of their symbolic identity. As the legal battles intensified, internal tensions within the Mongols escalated. Legal costs rose, surveillance increased, and many members faced the possibility of decades in prison. Whispers began circulating in clubhouses, accusations that Cavazos' leadership had brought unwanted attention, doubts about his handling of club finances, and allegations that he was using funds meant for legal defense to support a lavish lifestyle. One former associate described the atmosphere as poisonous. Paranoia became routine. Members no longer knew who they could trust. Some believed Cavazos had become a tyrant, leading them toward ruin. By the summer of 2013, the club had reached a breaking point. While Cavazos publicly fought the Justice Department, factions within the Mongols held secret meetings to remove him. The issue had grown beyond leadership disagreements. It was about survival. On August 6, 2013, during a national meeting, the coup took place. Former loyalists and members of the National Board voted to remove Cavazos from power. He was stripped of his title, expelled from the club, and cut off from the very organization he once ruled. Investigators would later argue that Cavazos sought alliances with the Mexican mafia to gain more power, attempting to control drug trafficking and territory. Such alliances placed the Mongols in further danger, as criminal organizations expected payment and loyalty in return. Reuben Cavazos' empire did not fall to an enemy on the street. It collapsed under the weight of internal betrayal, federal pressure, and decisions that fractured the brotherhood he once dominated. His rise and fall remain one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of American outlaw motorcycle clubs. The man who once called himself President for Life had been overthrown by his own inner circle. But Reuben Cavazos was not the type to disappear quietly. To him, the vote that removed him was not legitimate. It was an act of treason. He and a faction of loyal supporters, possibly numbering in the hundreds, broke away to form their own splinter group, insisting that they, not the National Board, represented the true Mongols. What followed was a period of intense internal conflict. Threats were made over the phone. Members were beaten as punishment for perceived disloyalty. Clubhouses that had once been safe havens became armed fortresses and, in many cases, targets. The conflict escalated quickly. Shootings, firebombings, and brutal assaults. This was no longer a quiet, hidden dispute. It was a violent, personal war, former brothers now seeing one another as mortal enemies. A law enforcement official later explained, "We saw a significant and alarming rise in violence tied directly to the split. Rivalries between clubs are somewhat predictable, but when a club turns on itself, the violence becomes intensely personal, more vicious, and far less predictable. It's the worst-case scenario for public safety and incredibly difficult for law enforcement to manage." Reuben Cavazos had become a king without a kingdom, a commander whose own forces had risen against him. And in a final twist of fate, many of the same men who removed him would later testify against him as star witnesses in the government's effort to dismantle the organization he once led. The stage was set for a series of trials that would dismantle his legacy, piece by piece. With the club divided and its leadership in turmoil, the federal government launched its final offensive. Between 2019 and 2022, a sequence of major trials unfolded. Even when Cavazos was not directly named as a defendant, the cases focused heavily on the criminal enterprise he had built. The first major trial began in 2019, United States versus several Mongols members. The prosecution relied on the RICO statute to weave dozens of acts, drug trafficking, assaults, shootings, into one unified narrative. Their argument was that these were not isolated crimes, but coordinated actions within a structured criminal organization shaped by the leadership model Cavazos had created. A former federal prosecutor explained, "The RICO strategy was essential. We weren't simply prosecuting individual acts. We were proving a criminal enterprise existed, the Mongols Motorcycle Club, and that its members carried out crimes as part of that organization." The evidence was vast, hundreds of hours of wiretaps, encrypted conversations about narcotics and violence, surveillance footage, financial records, and most importantly, the testimony of former high-ranking members. These witnesses were the same men who had orchestrated Cavazos' removal. They took the stand and described the operations of the club under his leadership: narcotics distribution networks, extortion schemes, violent conflicts with rival clubs, and the chain of command that they claimed led directly to Cavazos. Defense attorneys attacked the credibility of these witnesses, calling them liars and opportunists, hoping to reduce their own prison time. But the recorded evidence, audio, video, documents, was extensive. The jury believed the prosecution's story, a violent criminal organization guided from the top. Guilty verdicts followed, yet the government's most devastating victory had not yet arrived. In 2020, after more than a decade of litigation, a federal appeals court ruled on the government's attempt to seize the Mongols' trademarks, a strategy first introduced in 2008. The ruling was historic. Although the government could not eliminate the club entirely or take control of the trademark for all purposes, the court approved a powerful injunction. Any Mongols member convicted of a RICO offense could be permanently prohibited from wearing or displaying the club's insignia, including the central patch. This was more than a legal ruling. It was a psychological blow aimed at the heart of the organization. For outlaw bikers, the patch is everything. Losing it is the ultimate humiliation, a public declaration that you are no longer part of the brotherhood. The ruling turned the federal courthouse into a place where identities could be legally stripped away. A conviction now meant more than prison. It meant the destruction of one's place in the outlaw world. The trials continued into 2021 and 2022. More leaders were convicted. More sentences were handed down. The message was unmistakable. The era of Reuben Cavazos was over. The faction that removed him now presided over a club being methodically dismantled by the justice system. Where was Cavazos during the collapse of his empire? He was already in federal prison. His involvement in the club's internal war, including an attempted murder charge tied to the violent split, had resulted in his conviction on separate racketeering offenses. In 2015, he was sentenced to nearly 20 years in federal prison. The later convictions of his former brothers served as a public confirmation of his downfall. Each guilty verdict was another chapter in the story of his decline. The once feared president for life was now an inmate, watching from a cell as the organization he helped build crumbled. A law enforcement official noted, "For someone like Cavazos, isolation is its own punishment. Power, respect, and influence were everything to him. In prison, none of that matters. His old title has no meaning. If anything, it makes him a target. He's just another inmate waiting for the years to pass." Cavazos' projected release date is 2031. By then, he will be an elderly man entering a world that has moved far beyond him. The Mongols Motorcycle Club still exists, but it is a diminished version of its former self, legally constrained, internally scarred, and forever marked by the Civil War and federal prosecutions that reshaped it. A former associate summarized it. They always said the patch was forever. But after everything that happened, the betrayals, the trials, the brothers testifying against brothers, that patch got stained. Doc won't be remembered as the president who built the club. He'll be remembered as the one who lost it. The downfall of Reuben Doc Cavazos left two major legacies: a new legal precedent. The patch forfeiture strategy is now a permanent tool in the federal arsenal, available for use against any organized group whose identity is tied to a symbol. A lesson in the limits of absolute power. Cavazos' authoritarian leadership created the resentment that led to his removal. The loyalty he demanded became the catalyst for his own downfall. His story is a modern cautionary tale, a rise and fall shaped by ambition, betrayal, and the relentless pressure of federal prosecution. It shows that even the most feared leaders are vulnerable to the combined forces of internal dissent and government action. In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, history is often written in patches, in blood, and in court transcripts. The fall of Reuben Cavazos remains one of the most dramatic chapters ever recorded.